So, good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's episode on isochrony, meaning things that are in the same time. This is the top category for things like vowel reductions, syllable lengths, and poetic meters that we are actually talking about today. But this litany here below was somewhat long for a primary title, so I turned it into a secondary title. The original plan for this topic was just about reduced vowels turning into voiceless vowels, which is something somewhat bizarre for the speakers of many Western languages. But while I was thinking about making a short clip about that topic, I realized that I had certain questions that I would ask myself if I were presented with such a clip, and I thought that I should address those questions myself. So this turned into an entire episode. Let's start with vowel reduction in general. Good evening, Shinhailos. So, particularly vowels in unstressed syllables tend to become weaker. This is a process that happens a lot in English. In English, the neutralized vowel is pronounced in the middle of the mouth, so it's a If you think about English words, you can imagine basically any usual vowel symbol being used for this sound. I think university, for example, might have two of those, depending on how you pronounce it. And this is part of the vowel reduction process, in which usually stressed syllables remain clear and distinct, but unstressed syllables lack some kind of extremity that exists in the stressed syllables. An example of this is Italian, which has these 7 vowels in this chart. So up is high, that's an H, not an N. Then low is low. This is where the tongue is physically in the mouth. So when you say ah, your tongue is physically down, low in your mouth. And then you have the front and back axis. So E in Italian is very much front and very high. So E. If you are an English speaker, you might also be familiar with something that you might think of as an E that sits here closer to the middle, such as in the word kit. Kit, E, kit, kit. Different sounds, and not just the pitch. I think I probably changed the pitch as well. But the point of articulation is different. And all of these 7 vowels can appear in stressed syllables, but only 5 of them can appear in unstressed syllables. So out of these 2 A's, the normal A is higher in the mouth, A, and the Greek epsilon is lower in the mouth, closer to A, so A, A. An example word for this is bene, where the first syllable is stressed, has the lower A, and the second syllable is unstressed and has the higher A. And then, for example, the future in Italian ends with an O, but that is the lower O. For example, dormirò, the ro syllable has a lower O, but the first syllable, do, has the higher O, so dormirò, to overpronounce. And as I already mentioned, skipping ahead a little bit, the kind of vowel reduction that happens in English is neutralized articulation, where the place where the vowel is pronounced moves towards the middle of the mouth. So, for example, this is also... Actually, now I can't think of any examples where the old hasn't disappeared entirely. But this also happens in Russian in a slightly different way. I have these two words here. One is хорошо. It is pronounced the same as the lower one with A, but it is written with O, because historically it was хорошо. But the unstressed syllables have been reduced, and in the case of Russian, this is often a movement towards the lower parts of the mouth. In some cases, also the higher parts of the mouth. It works differently than in English. And then the other example is хороший, in which case the second syllable remains an O because it is now the stressed one. Хорошо is the adverb, well, in a good way, and хороший is the the first is the adverb, second is the adjective. So a good something would be хороший. I can't remember what book is in Russian, but it would be хороший something. You might wonder if consonants can reduce as well. The same word isn't used, but there is a very similar process. I have written out a sonority hierarchy here with less sonorous sounds at the top and more sonorous at the bottom. And when you move down in this hierarchy, or higher, towards more sonorous sounds, that's called lenition. If you listen to the episode about snapshots on the road to French, you might have noticed some lenition happening. And the opposite process of this is called fortition. The Latin words behind this are lenis and fortis, so weak and strong. So the consonants become weakened or strengthened. The first one here is an example of lenition. This is from the Gallo-Romance stage of development, where this voiced stop becomes a voiced fricative, but remains in the same area of articulation. So you go from d to the. An opposite of this, here we have something of a spoiler for next week, for the snapshots from the road to German. This is something that happened in High German. You went from a voiceless fricative to a voiceless stop. For example, thaw in English, meaning that, for example, water melts. That is called tau in German, High German. So this is a case of fortition for this sound. And then, in some cases, you can have both or mixed. For example, the Grimm's law, which we went through on the episode of Snapshots from the Road to English, about a month ago, I think, features a chain moving both ways on this scale, and then also some aspiration, which is a different process altogether. So you can't think of this kind of fortition and lenition as something that only happens in isolation. It can also mix itself with other processes. And Grimm's law produced a chain where d, for example, turned into d, then d previously turned into t, and t turned into th. Brother, for example, was b, had a b, aspirated voiceless stop, turned into a voiced stop, and so on. Pater, father, turns from p into th. Is this about the reductive nature of languages, Professor? No, this is about reduction. This is mechanical reduction. Here I'm trying to think of a good explanation for the word reduction in this context. I think you should think of it as a synonym for weakening. So, for example, in this case, the lenition of the consonants is called a weakening in Latin, and in the same way, you could think that the vowels are weakened as well, either by the inventory of vowels weakening, becoming smaller, or the area of pronunciation becoming weaker or less extreme in the case of English and Russian. Then let's get back to voicing. I think I've gone through this a couple of times, but there may be listeners who did not attend those shows, and it's always good to do some repetition. So voicing means that your vocal folds vibrate when you make the sound. So an s is unvoiced, but a z is voiced. You can easily check this yourself by putting your fingertips on your voice box, and if it moves while you're speaking, then the sounds you are making are voiced. Usually, we are talking about consonants here. So an unvoiced labial stop is p. A voiced one is b. An unvoiced velar fricative, so at the back of the roof of the mouth, is h, and a voiced one is that one's difficult for me to produce because I don't actually speak any living language that would use this sound. There are two things that must happen for voicing to occur anatomically. One is that you have more pressure in your lungs than in your mouth. This is usually very easy because you talk by pushing air from your lungs into your mouth. So you practically have to have an overpressure in the lungs. And the other one is that your voice box must be tensed. You can, for example, you can produce a longer sound that is unvoiced, like s. You are producing an airflow, so there is overpressure in the lungs, but the voice box stays relaxed. So both of these can happen when you are making vowels as well, and most likely you have never heard an unvoiced vowel, and you might wonder what it sounds like or what it feels like to produce. The easiest way to do is by whispering. If you whisper, you are not producing such a pressure differential between your mouth and your lungs that you would start to voice even the vowels. I hope you heard that. I tested the sound settings a little bit and it seemed to work. Another one for making full volume voiceless vowels. Vowel reduction, this is the case for Japanese, and constriction in the mouth, which happens in Parisian French. I speak some standard French and I have not run into this phenomenon, so it might be that this only happens in colloquial, maybe Parisian French as spoken by younger people. In the case of vowel reduction, this is the kind of vowel reduction that ends up with the vowel being eliminated entirely. This has also happened in English. A lot of the kind of words that have a silent E at the end of the word actually used to have an at the end of it, a reduced E. And further in the midst of history, that probably was an E. So for example, have most likely was pronounced have at some point, then have, and then have. In this case, the vowel has been destroyed entirely and the two syllables have merged into each other. This is also what happens in Japanese. So you might hear some high vowels in Japanese being pronounced fully, weakly, or not at all. And we'll get to that in the next slide. And then for the constriction in the mouth, this is most likely the reason that full volume unvoiced vowels can occur in Parisian French at all, because these are sometimes even stressed syllables. And why does this happen with high vowels, you might ask? Well, that's because the tongue is high in the mouth. So you have less free space in the mouth, so you end up with a higher pressure in the mouth. So the pressure differential between the lungs and the mouth is much weaker than it would be for a low vowel. Since we won't really be getting back to French, I'll try to demonstrate a full volume non-voiced vowel through French. So voiced would be E, and unvoiced would be something like It's kind of whispery, but that's the strongest volume that I can produce personally. Then, getting to how vowels become voiceless. This is something that I mostly went through during the last slide already. But here we have examples from Japanese. Here we have sukiyaki, which is a kind of grilled dish. I think that's the Japanese pancake, as some people call it. So it's grilled with what you want. Here the second syllable is stressed, so the su at the beginning is unstressed. And it becomes reduced and then for some speakers eventually deleted. So you have this range of fully pronounced sukiyaki, then weakly pronounced sukiyaki, su, 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 and then eventually the u disappears entirely and the first two syllables merge into ski, skiyaki. And we have a word with 3 syllables instead of 4. And here we have the example from English that have used to be pronounced have, but is no longer because the last has disappeared entirely and the syllables have merged. I think we had a fair amount of examples of something like this in the episode Snapshots for French as well. So, getting to the syllable lengths part. As you might have heard several times, Japanese is a mora-timed language. So the vowels in Japanese are supposed to ideally have fixed lengths. So you have either short or long vowels. The long vowels should take twice as long to pronounce as the short ones. But what actually happens when you have a reduction like this? I did some experiments. So the mora values for all of these 4 syllables are 1. When talking about mora values, you just ignore the starting consonant and count the amount of vowel time and syllable final consonants to get the mora values. As you can see, these are idealized. This is largely because actually different consonants take a different amount of time to produce. So the s actually takes an awful lot of time to produce compared to some of the stops, like k was, in my experiments, only 30 milliseconds. Excuse me, I've misspelled or misnotated millisecond here. We are not talking about nanoseconds. We are talking about milliseconds. There's, if you want to find actual publications about something related to this, you should look up voice onset time. Actually, I'm going to write that down as well in case someone wants to Google or Google Scholar it. Voice onset time. Usually this is about how long it takes for the voicing action, so the vibration in your voice box, to begin. I think because that is far more easily recognizable, more objectively recognizable than going from a voiced consonant into a voiced vowel. That, especially in my case, that was a fairly subjective decision. The voice onset times are values in milliseconds for how long it takes from the beginning of the sound until the voice box begins to vibrate. So this is basically 0 or negative, depending on where you put the 0 point for voiced consonants. So when you say ba, for example, the voice box begins to vibrate before the R begins. It is somewhat longer. 13 milliseconds was quite a reasonable result for me, because this is also what the literature told me that voiceless stops should take. So t, k, p all take about 30 or 40 milliseconds to pronounce. But then aspirated voiceless stops take even longer. And then having consonant clusters basically sums the voice onset times of these consonants for they just stack one after another, and then the vowel begins. So, getting back to the actual topic, here we have sukiyaki that should be ideally equally long, but this is not the case. The vowels themselves are actually within, say, 20% of each other. So for what is actually being counted, the vowels themselves, the Mora values are more or less correct, but they aren't an accurate representation of how much time the entire syllable takes to pronounce. So here we have about the half of the U time is lost when it begins to be reduced. When all of these, the vowel itself was about 100 120 milliseconds. So here we have 150 or so for the consonant itself. Let's say 100 for the vowel. Here we have 150 for the consonant and 50 for the vowel. So half of it. Interestingly enough, in my experiments, the second syllable ended up being lengthened a fair amount, but this could be an error in measurement, as it was also quite different between the first and second datasets. My datasets were made myself as a non-Japanese speaker or non-native Japanese speaker, so obviously they are not particularly valid. But there might be some kind of lengthening happening in the second syllable. So the Mora values more or less work for what they are used for, and the Mora values have a good predictive value in some phonological processes, such as gemination in the Baltic Finnic languages, for example, as well as Italian. Gemination is a process where a stop consonant becomes lengthened, and in particular in the Baltic Finnic languages, this is a process that has occurred to correct for the loss of syllables in the past. For example, you might have had a 3-syllable word that had a long, a short, and a short syllable, but perhaps a consonant or something has been lost in the middle, and you end up with a long and an extremely long syllable. Or perhaps even from short, you might have gone to short and long. It is not impossible for unstressed syllables to be longer than stressed syllables in more-timed languages. This is basically the definition for a more-timed language, but it sounds weird even for many native speakers. So in the Baltic Finnic languages, you have processes called general and specific gemination, where a word that has a short and then a long syllable, the beginning consonant of the long unstressed syllable is extended so that you start spanning, so tensioning the consonant in the first syllable. This is also something that you can, that as a process, not in this process, but as this phenomenon, you can find, for example, in Japanese. For example, if you think of the name Akko, if you say this a few times, you can do it, no one's listening, you might notice that Ak involves the A and a stop. This stop is the gemination. So you are tensioning your mouth for the K during the first syllable, and then the second syllable is the release of the K and the second vowel. So Akko. Then getting forwards. Once I got to timing myself saying words and phrases over and over again and measuring how long they take, I got to thinking about different timing values. You probably have heard at least once about the Mora timing, which we've gone through today, and then the opposite of that, the syllable and stress timing systems. Ideally, this would involve the stressed syllables always being longer than the unstressed syllables. And in syllable-timed languages, such as Spanish, this difference should be fairly small. And in stress-timed languages, such as Italian, this difference should be quite large. Whereas in Mora-timed languages, such as Latin, from which both of these have developed, there shouldn't be such a big difference between the lengths of stressed and unstressed syllables. So I looked up some poetry, read it out loud a number of times, and calculated the time values, and for Latin the Mora values of these syllables. For Latin we have Stabat Mater Dolorosa, which is a medieval Latin Christian poem and later song written by Jacopone di Todi, I think. There stood a suffering mother, so this is obviously about Jesus. Here we see that both of the syllables of the first word have a Mora value of 2, but their time value is quite different. But crucially, if we take about 30 milliseconds for the B, and then more than 100, what was it yet now? Maybe 150 for the S, then actually these are fairly similar. So for the ignoring the onset consonants, everything here appears to work actually quite well. Here we see that the absolutely longest syllable was sta, which is both moraically long and stressed, and has a very long s at the beginning of it. So it's no wonder that it would be long. The other ones are ter, is also quite long. This also has a high Mora value. Ro also has a high time and Mora value. R is is another one like s that usually takes a lot of time to pronounce. Surprisingly, I actually took quite a long time to pronounce the sa at the end of this line. That might just be a pronunciation mistake on my part. I also noticed that I did not pronounce this as sa. I pronounced it distinctly reduced to a sort of s, which is not correct pronunciation for Latin. Then for Spanish, the example line was "No sabe que es amor quien te no ama," which is a line from who was that? Paco de Lopa? Something de Lopa. I would have looked up something from Cervantes, but he didn't actually write a lot of poetry, so I wanted to have a poetic example for all languages. Here we can see that a lot of the syllables are actually quite short. Even the stressed ones are much shorter than they will be in Italian. In this case, the mur is overwhelmingly longer than the others. There might be several reasons for this. One is, of course, the r, which takes a while to pronounce on its own. But this is also a stressed syllable on the word level, and it is a stressed syllable on the sentence level. So, even if I am not a particularly good Spanish speaker, this is probably not a huge mistake on my case, my part. And then for Italian, we have Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita, which is from Dante Alighieri, the opening line of the Divine Comedy. And in this case, we see that the stressed syllables are overwhelmingly longer than the non-stressed syllables. This is the case in every word and by a fair margin. This is about 100 milliseconds in each case, about 50% longer than the unstressed one. And then, on a bit of a tangent, once we get into the lengths of syllables in variously timed languages, you know what is practical use for these syllable times? Poetry. There are a couple of ways to classify poetic meters. In some languages or in some meters, you alternate between heavy and light syllables, which means long and short syllables. And in some languages and traditions, you alternate between stressed and unstressed syllables. And when you look at the lists of these languages, the languages that traditionally or often use a syllable length distinction are Mora-timed. And the languages that commonly use a stress distinction are stress or syllable-timed. So what is actually happening here in both cases is that you alternate between syllables which are long and syllables which are short. Then I have looked up a couple of classical poetic meters. The first one is dactyl. If you run into this in literature, it will probably be combined with some other word like dactylic hexameter, for example. It means that in hexameter you have 6 of these units for one line. And the dactyl here is 1 long and 2 short. So tan tata, tan tata, tan tata, tan tata, and so on. This example is Latin. Is arma virumque cano, and so on, which doesn't sound bad, in my opinion at least, but it feels very awkward to me because the heavy part of the poetic foot lands on an unstressed syllable, because this is historically Greek poetic meter, which I don't think was quite appropriate to be used with Latin. I don't speak Greek myself, so I can't say if it sounded more natural in Greek. Most likely it did. But the Romans also took to using it as a part of their adoration of Greek culture, which was huge. Sometimes when you read Latin texts, you might run into Greek words that are, not only are they loan words from Greek, but they are written even with the Greek alphabet in the middle of Latin, and they are conjugated as they are in Greek. So if you run into a Greek word that would be in the accusative, it would be just written in the Greek accusative in Greek letters. This is a level of adoration that I don't think even the English with French or the Japanese with Chinese have quite reached at any point. And this is from the Aeneid or Aeneis in Latin, written by Vergilius. What was his first name? Publius Vergilius. So this is an adventure story about some Trojan heroes having a seaborne adventure and ending up in Italy and founding Rome. A bit of patriotic historiography for the Roman Empire. The second example here is a iamb. You might run into a iambic pentameter, for example, of which this one is an example of. Here you have the unstressed and then stressed, so tatan, tatan, tatan. And this example is two households, both alike in dignity, which is something that most likely native English speakers will recognize, as this is from William Shakespeare and the Romeo and Juliet. The opposite of a trochee, the opposite of a iamb is the trochee, which begins with the heavy and ends with the light syllable. So you have tan, ta, tan, ta, tan, ta, tan, ta. This actually becomes very common for later Latin, medieval Latin poetry, for example. Here the example is Wie der Fluss in Breit und Länge, which is from Faust by Johann von Goethe. Or, what is it, Wolfgang? No, Goethe in any case. And then some more exotic meters. The first one is the Alexandrine. This is something that is used in modern French, and it has 5 lights and a heavy. So ta 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 tan, ta 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 tan. This is something that you have to use at the more of a sentence length. And I don't think this is particularly suitable to be used with other languages than French, because French, for one, has a fairly unusual stress pattern in that the stressed syllables are systematically the last syllables. And this is because in the phonetic history of the French language, words that used to be, for example, 3 syllables, have merged so that the second stressed syllable is now the last one. So, as usual, the poetic meter fits the language in which it is being used. And this example line is sur une barricade au milieu des pavés, which is from Victor Hugo and is titled Sur une barricade. Then getting into Japanese. This meter is renga, which is an alternating between 5 and 7 lines. Lines of 5 and 7 mora. This is copied from Chinese. In Chinese, it was 5 or 7 syllables, but in Japanese, this has been changed into mora, moras or more, if you want to be particularly Latin about it. For example, haiku and senryu are examples of Brenga meter poetry. Often this gets slightly misunderstood as 575 syllables, but it is not syllables, it is mora. This is an easy mistake to make because a huge amount of Japanese syllables are in fact monomoraic, so they only have a short vowel within it. Very few syllables have syllable final consonants. When they do, they are either geminates, like akko, so that's actually more of a pause than an actual consonant, or they are nasals, such as in senpai, or even renga, or they are sibilants where the next syllable has been reduced away. For example, des, for example, or deshta. In both cases, the e and u in desu and deshita have been reduced away, and the amount of syllables has collapsed. This is an example from Senryu himself, Karai Senryu, I think. And in this poem, we only have one syllable here that has a long o in it, and therefore is a bimoraic syllable, so a syllable that lasts for 2 units of time. This is dorobo toraetemireba vagakonari. So when I catch the robber, I see that he is our son. And then, as the last major slide, seems that today's episode has been slightly short, but no worries. We get into rhyming. This is another tangent of a tangent. We are now taking a tangent out of poetry. As I'm sure you know, in many languages and in many poetic traditions, you want words to rhyme when you are making poems. But what does rhyming actually mean? The word has 2 definitions. One is the syllabic rhyme. In this context, usually the older orthography, the spelling is used. This is a French loan word in English. I think at the time that it was loaned, it was most likely still being said as rime. In modern French, it is rime. So the syllabic rhyme is the nucleus and coda, so the vowels and the ending consonants of a syllable. So basically the parts that count for the mora values in mora-timed languages. But when we are talking about poetic rhyme, and usually using the more modern spelling for this, there isn't really a mechanical definition for rhyme like there is for the syllabic rhyme, because this is more of a definition for use rather than any sort of mechanistic or functional definition. When you're talking about poetic rhyme, it basically means that different syllables match in some way. There are various ways, and some of these are found to be more valuable in poetry of different languages. For example, in English, the syllabic rhyme being used to rhyme with is called the perfect rhyme. So obviously this is something that is valued in English language poetry, such as fight and flight. Here all the differences are in the onset consonants. But then, for example, you have alliteration, where the onset consonants and or the vowels are the same. This is usually valued in languages that do not use prepositions like English does, but rather postpositions or postfixes, such as the Uralic languages. I think that there's a very simple reason for this, because when you use prepositions, it becomes extremely easy to match the beginnings of words or set phrases of a couple of words. For example, to me, to you. This is something like this is trivial in English. But if the grammatical functions go to the end, then it becomes trivial to produce rhymes at the end. So let's take I think I'll have to take a Finnish language example because, of course, Japanese is more familiar to most of you, I imagine. But Japanese poetry generally doesn't care about the rhyme. It's a lot more about the meter. So let's take the same to me and to you. Minulle, sinulle. You notice that the endings of these words are identical because they are using the same grammar, just as the beginnings of these phrases, many phrases are identical in English. So in a language like this, the so-called perfect rhyme is useless. If you take this as a way to rhyme words, then you can rhyme any words, as long as you are using them in the same grammatical construction. And then you have some of the smaller parts, such as assonance, is when only the vowels are the same. I might have had to write some examples of these. I can't think of any off the top of my head. And then if both the onset and final consonants are the same, then you might call that a pararhyme. These probably work fairly well in English, which has a lot of consonant, vowel, consonant syllables in it. You also have sometimes the distinction between rhyming strong and strong, or stressed and stressed syllables with each other. This is also called a perfect rhyme in English, or rhyming stressed and unstressed syllables, which gets called a near rhyme in English. So what we can take out of this is that if you want to rhyme in English and be called perfect, you should rhyme the vowels and the final consonants of syllables, and those syllables should be both stressed. But if you are rhyming in a different language, you should check up on what is actually valued in that language, because it might be different than in English. So, with that, we are actually at an end here. It seems that the base plate of my slides is no longer large enough. It does not hide the entirety of the previous slide. So let's have a bit of chat here at the end. Do you have any questions or comments, or do you perhaps have recommendations for someone to rate? I will look up my own ideas in the meanwhile. Hello, Robert Brown. Unfortunately, you are quite late. We're already at the end. Once we end the recording, you will of course be able to see the VOD immediately. But unfortunate, you've slept for quite a while, or live on a radically different time zone. In about 1 hour, I will have a collaboration with username Bonne Madame Fleur about the late Ludwig Wittgenstein. If that is of interest to you, then I suggest hanging around for about an hour and then checking back. It seems that there are no questions or comments, so I will stop the recording. Have a good time of day, viewers on YouTube.